I decided that I needed to disconnect from the daily chaos, to take a few days away from everything. I had always found peace in hiking, in the solitude of nature, in that constant rhythm of my footsteps, and the fresh air filling my lungs. This time I chose a place that many described as magical and challenging, Green Ridge National Park. I had heard about its dreamlike landscapes, miles and miles of trails twisting through ancient forests and crystal-clear streams. It was perfect. I arrived at the park on a cool autumn morning, the kind of day where the air smells like damp leaves and the ground seems to be waking up after the rain from the night before. The leaves were already starting to change color, painting the forest in shades of gold, orange, and red. It was like being inside a painting. I checked in at the visitor center without paying much attention to the details. My only goal was to immerse myself in nature, to lose myself among the trees and let the stress of everyday life fade away. As soon as I set foot on the trail, I felt that peace. Just me, the forest, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and the song of some bird that seemed to be in no hurry. I walked for what felt like hours with no fixed direction, just following the path that stretched out before me. But deep down there was something, I don't know what, a feeling. As if everything was too perfect. Maybe it was the solitude, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind. But I didn't care, I felt good. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I almost didn't notice when the trail became narrower, darker. The trees seemed to lean towards me as if closing ranks. Something changed. The air felt different, heavier. That's when I saw him. A few meters ahead of me, among the shadows of the trees, there was a man crouched down. He was next to a couple of large sacks. My first thought was that he was another hiker, maybe taking a break. But there was something in his posture, in the way he looked around, that unsettled me. I can't quite explain why, but I felt a kind of alarm in my head, like my instinct was telling me something wasn't right. The man was wearing dark, worn-out clothes and a cap that hid most of his face. He moved in a methodical way, almost like he had a routine. At one point, he lifted one of the sacks and slung it over his shoulder. That's when it hit me. They weren't sacks. They were children, 2 children, motionless as if they were asleep, hanging from his shoulders as if they weighed nothing. My mind couldn't process it at first. What was this man doing with 2 children in the middle of the forest? Why were they so still? A cold chill ran down my spine. Without thinking much, I pulled out my phone and with trembling hands took a picture. I made sure not to make any noise, though my hands were shaking so much I almost dropped the phone. The children didn't move, didn't make a sound. The scene was surreal, like the entire forest had held its breath. The man paused for a moment, looked around, and as if satisfied that no one was watching, began walking toward a denser part of the forest. That was when I had to make a decision. Should I follow him or not? My whole body screamed that I should go back, that it wasn't my problem, that I couldn't risk it. But something, a small voice in the back of my mind, told me those children were in danger, that I couldn't leave them. My heart was pounding, but my feet started moving instinctively, following him at a safe distance. Each step filled me with fear. Every crunch under my boots felt like an announcement of my presence, and the man walked so silently, as if he was used to moving without being heard. As I went deeper into the forest, the vegetation became denser, darker. The shadows seemed to stretch as if they were following me, and he, without stopping, kept carrying the children as if they were mere objects. I don't know how long I followed him, but every minute felt like an eternity. I was terrified. With each step, my heart beat faster. The branches cracked under my boots, and the fear gripped me to the point where I felt a knot in my stomach. In the distance, I could still see the man, walking with those children hanging from his shoulders. I had no idea what he was doing, but my instinct told me nothing good could come of it. Maybe I should have turned back. Maybe I should have called someone right then. But curiosity and fear pushed me to keep going. After a while, the man stopped. He stood still for a moment, and I almost felt my legs freeze in terror, wondering if he had seen me. But he didn't turn around. On the contrary, he seemed to be watching something ahead of him, something I couldn't yet see. He slowly crouched down and laid the children on the ground with an eerie calm. Then he disappeared into the thicket, heading towards what looked like the entrance to a hidden cave. My mind was racing. What was happening here? The cave was barely visible through the vegetation, but something about it made my skin crawl. There was a strange air around it, as if it were a place no one should approach. but at the same time I felt drawn to it. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen grew with each passing second. I decided to move a little closer. My breathing was so heavy I feared the man might hear me, though he was no longer in sight. The children remained motionless, lying on the ground as if they were deeply asleep. I couldn't understand it. Why wasn't anyone screaming? Why wasn't anyone asking for help? The silence grew more disturbing with each step I took. I crept closer, hiding behind some bushes right at the entrance of the cave. I felt my heart was going to burst out of my chest. The man was inside, but I couldn't see what he was doing. Fear gripped me, but something compelled me to stay, to keep watching. What was he doing with those children? Why were they inert like mere dolls? I crouched down a little more, trying not to make a sound. I was so focused on what I was seeing that I didn't notice the faint noise behind me. Something moved among the bushes, and I felt a chill run down my back. I wasn't alone. My body tensed immediately, and I barely managed to stifle a scream. I slowly turned, expecting to come face to face with the man, but I saw no one. Just an eerie silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. I turned my attention back to the cave. The man had come out of the darkness, but he was no longer alone. Something in his expression had changed, as if he were more relaxed, more confident. And then I saw it. I don't know how to explain it, but it was as if reality broke in that moment. Behind him, in the darkness of the cave, I saw figures. They were shadows, human forms, but something wasn't right. They were too still, too immobile. And suddenly I understood what I was seeing. They were bodies. Terror gripped me. I was petrified. The bodies hanging in the cave didn't move, didn't breathe, but they were there, piled one on top of the other in different stages of decomposition. They weren't just children. They were adults too, all motionless, as if they had been caught at the exact moment of their death. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The horror had paralyzed me completely. I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet, or maybe it was my own mind crumbling. What was that place? What was that man doing? My body finally reacted. I couldn't stay there. I knew that if he saw me, I would be next. I slowly backed away, my legs barely obeying, but I managed to turn around. I felt like the entire forest was watching me as I ran. I didn't care about making noise now. I just wanted to get out of there, to get as far away as possible from that cave and whatever was inside. My breathing was ragged, my feet tangled in roots and branches, but I didn't stop. The images of the bodies of the motionless children on the ground chased me. I fell several times, scraping my hands and knees on the dirt and stones, but fear gave me strength. I felt like every shadow moving among the trees was the man, following me, stalking me. The way back seemed endless. I didn't know if I was going in the right direction. Everything looked the same. The tall trees, the fallen leaves, the crunching branches. Every sound was amplified in my mind, and the panic grew with each step. I couldn't shake the images of that cave, of the bodies piled up, of the man walking with those children. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw the visitor center. I had never felt so relieved in my life. I ran to the reception, panting and with my face covered in sweat and tears. I told them everything I had seen, though at first the words barely came out of my mouth. They looked at me incredulously, as if they couldn't believe what I was saying, but everything changed when I showed them the picture I had taken. The horror on their faces was enough to know that they too understood the gravity of what was happening. The image on the phone said it all. The faces of the visitor center staff went pale when they saw the photo of the children hanging limply over that man's shoulders. I didn't have to say much more. They understood that something terrible was happening in that park, right at that moment. An emergency protocol was activated. The staff called the police, who told them they were already on their way. But for me, every passing second felt like an eternity. The visitor center, which had once seemed cozy, now felt suffocating. The wooden walls seemed to close in on me, and the air smelled of fear. Outside, the afternoon was already starting to fade, and the golden light that had been so beautiful at the start of my walk now seemed somber. My head kept replaying the image of the bodies in the cave, the immobile shadows that I couldn't get out of my mind. They sat me in a small room while we waited for the police to arrive. Someone offered me water, but I couldn't drink. My stomach was in knots. My hands were still shaking, and I couldn't stop looking at the phone, hoping the photo would disappear as if it had all been a bad dream. But no, there it was. That man with the children hanging as if they were just sacks of meat. Every sound startled me. The creak of the door, the whisper of the park employees, the sound of the phone vibrating at the reception desk. My mind was playing tricks on me, imagining that the man had followed me, that he would appear at the door at any moment, that he was coming for me just like he had gone for those children. I was afraid to close my eyes, afraid of what I would see if I did. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I heard the sound of sirens. The police arrived quickly, but for me, every minute of waiting had been agony. They asked me questions, lots of questions. I tried to explain as best I could, but I felt like the words were stuck in my throat. I pointed them to the trail where I had followed the man. I described the cave as best I could. My account was broken, full of pauses and labored breaths. They took note of everything, but I could see in their eyes that they were worried. They knew they didn't have much time. A rescue team and several officers prepared to head into the forest. The idea of returning to that place, even though I wasn't the one doing it, filled me with terror. I offered to go with them, to show them exactly where I had seen the cave, but they told me it was better if I stayed. Reluctantly, I agreed, though inside something told me not to let them go alone. I knew what was in that forest. I knew what awaited them. Minutes turned into hours. Meanwhile, I waited, waiting for news, waiting for someone to say everything was fine, that they had found the children, that the man had been captured. But the silence in the room was unbearable. Only a few of us remained, me and some members of the staff who also seemed tense. We couldn't do anything but wait. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers returned. His expression said it all. They had found the cave. They had found the children. But the news wasn't as hopeful as I had expected. The children were alive, yes, but they were in shock, disoriented and terrified. They could barely speak, and they didn't know how long they had been there. The officer continued his account, and what he said next left me frozen. Further inside the cave, in a section they had barely been able to illuminate with their flashlights, they found something much worse. The remains of other bodies. Bodies that had been there for weeks, maybe months. Bones scattered among the darkness. Decomposing bodies that hadn't been lucky enough to be rescued in time. The horror they had uncovered was far greater than any of us had imagined. I was speechless. The knot in my stomach tightened more and more until I felt like I couldn't breathe. The bodies, the children. How was it possible that something like this could happen in a place like this? Green Ridge, that natural paradise, had become a nightmare. And worst of all, the man had disappeared. They hadn't found him. The cave was empty except for the remains of his victims. The search for the man intensified. The police organized teams and combed every corner of the park, every trail, every path. But he had vanished like a ghost. They left no stone unturned, no path unexplored. But it was as if he had evaporated into thin air. No one could understand how a man carrying 2 limp children in broad daylight had managed to disappear so quickly without a trace. The community was in shock. The news spread quickly, and the horror of what had happened in Green Ridge shook the country. The park, once a place of peace and tranquility, was now tainted by fear and tragedy. The families of the missing children were notified, and pain and despair filled the air. As for me, I couldn't shake the thought that I had been so close to that man, to that monster. That maybe if I had been quicker, if I had screamed, if I had done something more, those children would be fine. But the guilt was a weight I couldn't shake. I knew I had done the right thing, but that didn't ease the fact that there were still nameless remains in that cave, that there were still families waiting for answers. The leaves crunched beneath my feet as I slowly advanced along the winding trail of Deepwoods National Park. The fresh, almost biting air filled my lungs, and my steps were light at first, just as I had always felt at the beginning of a hike. It was my escape, my way of relieving stress, of getting away from the daily routine. That morning, nothing seemed out of place. The sun filtered through the towering trees, creating golden beams of light that made the forest look like something out of a fairy tale. The ancient Pines Trail was famous for its beauty, and though it was usually busy, that morning I felt lucky to have the place practically to myself. Everything seemed perfect. The birds sang in the distance, and the gentle whisper of the wind through the branches made me feel at peace. But that feeling wouldn't last long. After a while, I noticed something strange. A few meters behind me, there was a man walking. It wasn't unusual to see other hikers, but something about his presence unsettled me. He was wearing a dark jacket and a cap that obscured his face. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But every time I took a step, I could hear the echo of his footsteps, synchronized with mine as if he were mimicking my movements. I decided not to look at him immediately, but my instinct screamed that something wasn't right. When I quickened my pace, I hoped he would pass me, but what happened was even more unsettling. He also sped up. I felt the tension take over me. The calm of the forest quickly crumbled, and the air, which had felt refreshing before, now seemed suffocating. I tried to stay calm, telling myself not to jump to conclusions, but my body was already on high alert. It was then that I decided to stop abruptly, pretending to take a photo or enjoy the scenery, hoping he would move on. But instead of doing so, he also stopped, and that's when real panic hit me. His gaze never left me. His eyes were dark, unfathomable, fixed on my back as if I were prey. The sensation of being hunted, of being watched with intentions I couldn't understand, ran through me from head to toe. I tried to smile briefly, as if it were just a casual encounter between two hikers, but my smile was more of a nervous grimace than anything else. Without saying a word, I turned and started walking again, this time taking a detour down a narrower and less traveled path, hoping to lose him. But I didn't. The sound of his footsteps echoed behind me, and fear began to take over every part of my body. The alternative trail was steeper, with roots protruding from the ground and low branches that scratched my arms as I passed. My feet stumbled over every obstacle, and sweat began to soak my back, despite the cold of the mountain. I tried not to run, not to appear desperate, but my heart rate quickened with each step. It was impossible not to hear his footsteps getting closer. I glanced back slightly, and there he was, closer than before. His face was partially covered by the cap, but what I could see froze my blood. His expression showed no emotion, but his eyes, those dark, empty eyes, looked at me with an intensity I couldn't interpret. There was no longer any doubt he was following me, and there was nothing casual about his behavior. The trail was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Loose stones made my feet slip, and the tangled roots forced me to slow down. But I couldn't stop. My legs were beginning to ache from the effort, and every breath became heavier. But fear pushed me forward. I knew that if he caught up to me, I wouldn't stand a chance. Finally, I saw a clearing in the distance, a small opening between the trees. My mind screamed that I would be safe there, that I had to reach that spot. I ran as fast as I could, but I felt his presence getting closer, as if he could smell my fear. The shadows of the forest seemed to move around me, as if the very woods were conspiring to trap me. When I reached the clearing, the first thing I saw was a small wooden cabin, old and covered in moss, as if it had been abandoned for years. Without thinking twice, I ran to the door and pushed it with all my strength. The wood creaked, but it gave way, and I entered the dark interior. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath while my heart pounded uncontrollably. The interior of the cabin was even more unsettling than the exterior. It was completely abandoned, with old broken furniture scattered across the floor. Dust floated in the air, and the silence was eerie. I could only hear my own gasps and the frantic beating of my heart. I knew I couldn't stay there for long, but I couldn't go out either. He would find me. Desperately, I searched for something I could use to defend myself. In a corner, I found a wooden stick, probably part of some broken furniture. It wasn't much, but at that moment I clung to it as if it were the only thing that could save me. The minutes passed slowly. Every creak of the floor made me jump. I was completely alone in that dark cabin, and fear made me imagine things that probably weren't there. But then I heard it. Footsteps outside. The sound of his steps approached, slow but steady. My body tensed, and I gripped the stick tightly. I couldn't let him in. I couldn't. But then, the door started to move. It opened slowly, and I saw the man's shadow cast on the floor of the cabin. My heart seemed to stop. I knew this was the moment that if I didn't do something, everything would end here. With all the strength I had left, I rushed toward the door and struck with the stick as hard as I could. I heard him grunt in pain as the stick hit him, and for a brief moment he staggered. That was my chance. Without thinking twice, I dropped the stick and ran out of the cabin. I didn't even dare to look back. I knew I had to get to a safe place, somewhere with people where someone could help me. I ran like I had never run before in my life. I felt my legs about to give out, the pain of my burning muscles, but I couldn't stop. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't leave that forest alive. My feet barely touched the ground as I ran nonstop, as if fear had given me wings. The pain in my legs mixed with the panic I felt in every inch of my body. The branches of the trees seemed to scratch me on purpose, as if the entire forest conspired to make me fall. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I knew that if I did, the man would catch me, and this time I wouldn't have the chance to escape. Every sound in the forest was amplified by my terrified mind. The crack of branches, the murmur of the wind through the leaves. Everything seemed to announce that he was getting closer. I knew I shouldn't look back, but the temptation was too strong. I glanced back for just a second and I saw him. He was there, just a few meters behind me, moving with a disturbing calm, as if he wasn't in a hurry, as if he knew he would eventually catch me. That glance was enough to make my heart stop for a second. My breathing was erratic and the cold air burned my lungs, but I couldn't stop running. My body was beginning to fail, every muscle ached, but the adrenaline kept pushing me forward. I knew that if I didn't find help soon, I wouldn't make it out of that forest alive. Suddenly the trail forked. One side led to a denser, darker part of the forest, while the other seemed to open up into a brighter area. My mind was clouded by fear, but instinctively I chose the more illuminated path, hoping it would lead me to a place where I could find help. Each step brought me closer to the possibility of escape, but I also felt the man drawing nearer. I ran without stopping until finally my eyes caught sight of something that gave me a glimmer of hope. In the distance I saw a group of hikers. There were 3 or 4 people, all with large backpacks and hiking gear, walking calmly, unaware of what was happening. I shouted with all my strength, but my voice barely came out. My throat was dry from running, and panic had stolen my words. Still, I kept running toward them, waving my arms desperately. One of the hikers saw me first, and his face went from confusion to alarmed recognition that something was wrong. When I finally reached them, my legs gave out, and I collapsed on the ground, gasping, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I tried to speak to explain what had happened, but the words came out choppy, incoherent. All I could do was point toward the forest where the man was still approaching. One of the hikers, an older man, came over and helped me to my feet. They asked me what had happened, but I could barely form a coherent sentence. Finally, through sobs, I managed to say, "He's following me. There's someone in the forest." The group reacted immediately. One of them took out their phone and called the police while the others surrounded me, trying to calm me down. Although I was surrounded by people, I still felt the fear inside me, as if the man could appear at any moment, as if there was no possible escape. The police arrived faster than I would have imagined, but those minutes of waiting felt endless. The air, which had seemed so refreshing earlier, now felt heavy, suffocating. The hikers tried to keep me calm, but I couldn't stop looking at the trees, expecting to see the man emerge from the shadows at any moment. When the officers finally arrived, everything happened quickly. They asked me questions, but my mind was still in that state of confusion and fear. I pointed them down the trail I had escaped from, trying to explain what had happened in the cabin, but my words were still mixed with the terror I felt. Everything seemed blurry. Everything except the fear. A search team was sent immediately. I knew they were professionals, that they knew how to handle these situations, but I couldn't shake the terror. What if they didn't find him? What if the man was still out there, waiting, stalking? My thoughts were a mess, a tangle of horrible images. Time passed that I couldn't measure. My eyes remained fixed on the tree line, even though I was surrounded by police and the hikers. The fear still gripped me, the fear that something would go wrong. But finally the officers returned with news. They had found the man. He was hiding in a cave not far from where I had taken refuge in the cabin. From what they told me later, the man was in a strange state, disoriented and muttering incoherently when they found him. He didn't resist arrest, and they took him straight to the police station for questioning. I felt a mixture of relief and horror knowing they had finally caught him. But that relief didn't last long. The news about the case spread quickly, and what the authorities discovered was even more disturbing. The man had been stalking hikers in national parks for years, always following the same pattern. He would walk behind his victims, terrifying them until they either managed to escape or fell into his hands. The stories began to surface. Other women came forward with similar accounts to mine, each describing the same paralyzing fear, the same terror I had felt. Although the man was in custody and had been diagnosed with severe schizophrenia, the fear didn't go away. The experience left deep scars, both physical and emotional. Even after it was all over, I couldn't walk through the forest without feeling like someone was following me, I couldn't walk alone without looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. That fear, that feeling of being watched, followed me everywhere. People told me I was lucky, that I should feel grateful to have escaped with my life. And I was. But I also felt an inexplicable guilt, a feeling that there was something more I could have done. Sometimes in my dreams I was back in that forest, running, hearing the leaves crunch under my feet, feeling him right behind me about to catch me. My life changed forever that day in Deepwoods, and although the man who followed me was no longer free, the shadows of that day will never fully fade away. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina called Bakersville, which is just over 16 miles from the Tennessee state line, and beyond that lies the famous Appalachian Trail. I never considered it until I moved somewhere else, but there's a certain spirit in Appalachia, especially in the lower half where the trail stretches into the Great Smoky Mountains and the Pisgah National Forest. Bakersville is about 20 miles north of Pisgah, right in the center of the triangle where the three forests converge, and I don't know if there's something in the trees, the hills, or the water, but it gets into people, for better or for worse. For instance, Appalachians are the most superstitious people I've ever met. Almost every culture has its little idiosyncrasies like that. You've probably heard someone say knock on wood to prevent something bad from happening, or maybe they've suggested that a black cat crossing your path is a sign of bad luck. Some people are told never to walk under ladders or that stepping on a crack will doom their mother to a broken back. But of all the people I've met in my travels, Appalachians win the prize for their bizarre superstitions. For example, my grandmother, God rest her soul, used to say she never trusted anyone with a dimple in their chin. She always used to say that dimples were made by the devil's shoe, and it wasn't just a silly saying to her, she genuinely believed it. She also thought that if your chickens laid an odd number of eggs, it meant misfortune was on the way, and that you should never, ever wash clothes on a Sunday. She had a ton of other crazy rules like that, and as I said, it wasn't a joke to her. She truly believed that doing certain things like carrying a hickory nut in her bra to ward off rheumatism would bring about the desired effect. And she also believed in the power of bad luck and black magic with all her heart and soul. I suppose we're much more inclined to believe in things like that down here in the lower Appalachians, things of a supernatural or fantastic nature. And that's why I believed my friend Scoot wholeheartedly when he said there was a witch living near Rattlesnake Ridge. I didn't believe him when he first told me, but he said his cousin swore on his eyes that there was a witch living there in a one-room cabin, and she had cursed 4 men right after the war who ended up dying under mysterious circumstances. But that's not all, and thanks to his cousin, he knew exactly where the witch's cabin was, on the south side of Rattlesnake Ridge. Naturally, I demanded that he take me there at the first available opportunity to prove that he and his cousin weren't a pair of rotten liars. But to my surprise, he indignantly promised to do so. We were 12 and 13 at the time, so we were capable of finding our way back after a long trek in the woods, and aware enough to want to show Scoot that his cousin was full of lies. So one Saturday, we set off early in the afternoon toward Rattlesnake Ridge. I understand it probably sounds like a dangerous trip for a couple of boys in their early teens, but if you grow up in rural North Carolina, you learn how to walk in the woods. I feel like there are stereotypes of southern outdoorsmen or Midwest mountain men sneaking through the woods like a cross between a jock and a ninja, but that's not entirely accurate. Any woodsman worth his salt walks firmly through the woods. Snakes detect vibrations, and the good thing about rattlesnakes is that they'll warn you of their presence if they don't hear you coming and slither away beforehand. Anyway, this is just to give you some context on why our parents were okay with us walking to a place named after a venomous snake. From our neighborhood, the walk to the ridge took about an hour at a casual pace until we finally saw the tree-covered ridge rising before us like a great sleeping giant. Scoot's cousin had said the witch's cabin was on the southeast side of the ridge and that we'd smell the smoke from her chimney before we saw it. This was the same chimney where she supposedly cooked the dismembered bodies of the children she captured before turning their bones into magical charms. I thought we'd spend an hour or two just wandering around, unable to see or smell anything, before Scoot finally accepted that his cousin was full of lies. But then suddenly, we started to detect something that smelled a lot like a campfire, or maybe even smoke coming from a witch's chimney. Scoot nearly fainted, telling me, I told you. I wasn't lying, referring to his older cousin. Honestly, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a chill run down my spine. I just remember standing there with my mouth open, going from not believing him to not wanting to believe him. It was creepy, sure, but creepy like a Boy Scout campfire ghost story. Smelling that smoke the way we did had a sort of perfect timing. Like when the innocent high school couple finds the hook still buried in the car door, or when the babysitter discovers the call came from inside the house. A chill ran down my spine, and it couldn't be real. There was no such thing as witches, and smelling campfire smoke was just evidence of a fire and nothing more. Once I realized that, I felt silly. Scoot's cousin was lying, and feeling silly only made me more determined to prove it. Besides, it was an excellent opportunity to show Scoot how brave I was by heading deeper into the woods to find the source of the smoke. He thought I was crazy, saying we needed to get out of there and that I must have had some kind of death wish for seeking out that witch. After all, she had already killed 4 men by cursing them, so there was no telling what she might do to 2 boys who deliberately ventured into her territory. I knew whoever was there probably wouldn't react kindly to strangers, but I also knew there were no witches, so I didn't go running through the woods. Instead, I pressed on with Scoot behind me, watching where the smoke was coming from. Then, about 200 yards ahead, we saw this thicket of myrtle, the dense kind with wavy leaves. And behind them was what looked like an old log cabin, with a large stone chimney on one side. And Scoot said, "Do you believe me now?" I admit the evidence was in his favor, but until we saw black cats and flying brooms, I didn't believe a word of it. And I wasn't about to come this far only to turn around now that we'd found what we were looking for. For those who don't know, wax myrtles grow quite close to the ground, meaning you have to duck under all the leaves and branches if you want to get through a patch of them. There were also a few dogwoods, which meant we had to zigzag to get to where we could see the log cabin in all its dilapidated glory. But when we finally laid eyes on that cabin, it looked exactly like you'd expect a witch's cabin to look. There was a broom right beside the small entrance with all sorts of dried herbs, wind chimes, and things that looked like charms hanging on either side of the door. Scoot nearly had a fit when he saw the broom, and I have to admit at that moment I really started to believe. But just as we were really and truly getting scared, the door to the cabin flew open, and out came the witch of Rattlesnake Ridge. She had uneven white hair, walked with a slight stoop, and I swear she had 1 or 2 warts on her nose and chin. I was about to wet myself with fear at the sight of her, cursing myself for not believing Scoot and his cousin, but at least I stayed quiet. Scoot, on the other hand, shouted in a trembling voice, "There she is, the witch." The witch heard him, turned around and looked in our direction, yelling, "Who's there? You better show yourselves." But by that point, Scoot and I were already running like frightened deer, deaf and blind to anything but getting as far away from Rattlesnake Ridge and the witch we never should have sought out. We were terrified, absolutely beside ourselves with fear. We were convinced the witch was going to curse us for invading her territory, and that it was only a matter of time before we too ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. We agreed to each go to our homes to ask our parents for help. Maybe the police could go there and convince the witch to lift her curse, but whatever we did, we had to do it fast. So after saying goodbye and what we hoped wouldn't be our final farewell, each of us headed home to plead for help from our parents. I remember holding back tears until I got to my parents' house, but as soon as I walked through the door and my mom asked why I looked so awful, I broke down and told her everything. How I hadn't believed Scoot and his cousin about the witch on the ridge, how we had trespassed on her property, and how we were now probably cursed to suffer a premature death. All the commotion brought my dad out of the garage, and he and my mom listened to the whole story before finally reassuring me. They told us there were no witches, but there was certainly an old woman living near that ridge. She had lived there for a long time, and all she wanted was to be left alone, which is why she got angry when she heard us in the bushes. She couldn't put any curse on us. We weren't going to die, but it wasn't a good idea to wander around in the woods for any reason, especially if that reason was to bother a poor old lady. Once they reassured me that the woman we saw wasn't a witch, I started to calm down a bit. But that didn't explain why a woman would live alone in the woods like that. And when I asked, they told me it was complicated, but she wanted to live there by herself. It wasn't that the people in town had been mean to her or anything like that. After that, my mom called Scoot's mom, and they talked to make sure everyone was on the same page. Scoot's parents were good people, so they told him pretty much the same thing they told me. We didn't have to be afraid of that old lady, but we shouldn't go snooping around her property ever again. Scoot and I were then able to talk on the phone, and we went from crying to laughing within minutes. It was pure relief, I think, and also funny how we had run away at full speed from a woman whose top speed was probably a couple of miles per hour. We moved on after that. I remember thinking about that woman from time to time, but I wasn't afraid of her. I just thought it was a bit odd that she chose to live alone in the woods like that. I didn't feel sorry for her. I mean, she chose to live there, and I didn't know why, but I didn't care to find out either. She was just the crazy old cat lady who lived in the woods, and like everyone else in town, that fact became as normal to me as anything else. I suppose a lot of other kids asked their parents the same thing. Scoot's cousin talked about the witch, and so did we when we got back to school that Monday. We told everyone we had been there and that she wasn't really a witch, and then we laughed at all the kids who swore she was and that we were doomed to die any day from the curse she had placed on us. The other kids had heard about those 4 men she supposedly cursed to die, but we knew the truth. We had adults telling us the not-so-scary truth, so we weren't afraid at all. And that pretty much settled the argument, as many other kids mentioned how their parents had told them the truth too. She was just a poor, strange old lady, and those 4 men's deaths had nothing to do with her. But as I came to learn, that wasn't strictly the truth. The first part of this story, my encounter with Scoot and the witch, took place in the mid-70s, a long time ago. I remember it was late April of 1975 because the TV was showing footage of Vietnam almost non-stop. Things were getting worse for the people on the ground, and I remember my dad watching films of helicopters lifting people off rooftops in Saigon. The next part, which doesn't have much to do with the witch, took place in 2004 when Scoot and I were home in Bakersville visiting family. There wasn't anywhere to drink alcohol around Bakersville, so we had to take a cab to Burnsville, about 10 miles south, to get drunk there before my sister drove down to pick us up at closing time. I hadn't seen Scoot in maybe 2 years at that point, and since the Panthers were playing that night, I wanted to beat him at pool and thought we'd take him to a little bar there to really make the most of things. Anyway, we headed there. The Panthers lost their game, but I won at pool, so that balanced things out. It was a weeknight, so the place was pretty empty during the last hour of service. Just a few customers in some booths and Scoot and I having our beers at the bar. We were deep in conversation, reminiscing about the past, and we talked about this and that until the subject of the witch from Rattlesnake Ridge eventually came up, and we started laughing, cursing Scoot's cousin for scaring us so much. But then, with years of experience behind us, we started speculating about why the witch lived there in the first place. I'm sure she didn't mind us calling her that, as her reputation certainly kept people out of her business. But it seemed strange to me that I had never taken the time to find out why she was there, and also who those 4 men who supposedly died were, and why people blamed their deaths on our witch's curse. We started speculating very casually. I didn't think she would still be alive. She was old when we were kids, so we both agreed she probably wouldn't be around anymore, almost 30 years later. Unless she really was a witch. Anyway, we were going back and forth talking about her when suddenly the older man sitting a few seats down from us at the bar asked the bartender for 1 more for him, and 1 more for each of the boys he was about to tell a long, spooky story to. He then invited us to sit with him, introduced himself as a former resident of our hometown, Bakersville. We introduced ourselves, thanked him for the beer, and then asked him what kind of spooky story he had to tell us as we laughed. I should have known it concerned the witch. I guess I was a little slow because of the beers. But when he told us he knew why the witch from Rattlesnake Ridge had chosen to live where she did, and furthermore, knew why people connected the deaths of those men to her, my interest was piqued. The old man told us that if this were 30 or 40 years ago, he wouldn't have dared to tell us the truth. But since everyone involved would have passed away by now, including the witch, there was no reason not to know the truth, especially if we had ever seen her with our own eyes, and foolishly I started to make fun of the guy, probably because of all the beers again. It wasn't that he had offered to tell us the story, or that he was doing it so dramatically, but that he was trying to tell us that the witch and the deaths of those 4 men were really connected in some way. I started asking him if she had turned them into frogs or flown on her broomstick to claim their souls on the full moon, but the guy shook his head, clearly not appreciating my attempts at humor. He told us the deaths of those men had nothing supernatural about them, but they were very much connected to the witch, and the reason she had chosen to live alone out there. He reiterated that if the people involved were still alive, there was no way in hell he would be telling the whole story to a brat like me, in his words. So if I didn't want to listen, I could take my beer and go to hell. His words again. If I wanted to listen, I could sit my ass down and find out why at least one of those men's deaths had to be connected to the witch, because one of the men had been her own damn husband. Then, I realized how terribly I had misjudged the whole situation, and in all my years I had never heard anyone mention that one of the witch's supposed victims had been her own husband. The fact that this guy knew that and was willing to tell us gave it a whole new level of legitimacy, so I sat down and listened to what he had to say. The witch's name was Dora Ann Quinlan, and in 1941 she married a man named James Cranwell. Their marriage was happy at first anyway, and then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the world changed overnight for them. Cranwell was drafted into the army and then sent to fight the Germans in North Africa, and at some point during his service, he was declared missing in action. A few months later, Dora Ann received word that many American bodies had been found. The Germans had taken them as prisoners and then, instead of sending them to some camp, those Nazi bastards massacred them, piled up their bodies, and then set them on fire. Some of James's belongings were found among the charred remains, so it was assumed he had been among those executed by the Germans. She received the news in the summer of 1942, and Dora Ann was devastated. She mourned for months, but by Christmas of 1943 it was said she was getting close to a grocery store clerk who had been declared unfit for service. I don't think you could find a single person who judged Dora Ann harshly for wanting to find happiness again. But still, she didn't want to tarnish the memory of her marriage to her late husband, so she chose to carry on the affair in secret, and that worked for them throughout all of 1944. But by the holidays of that same year, the affair was an open secret. Still, almost no one thought less of Dora Ann for wanting to rekindle a little romance in her life, so people just turned a blind eye while quietly waiting for a marriage proposal. But then, in early 1946, just when everyone expected Dora Ann and the clerk to get married, she received a telegram from the army with news that rocked her world as much as when the Japanese had sunk the Arizona with torpedoes. Her husband, James Arthur Cranwell, was alive. Cranwell had been a prisoner in one of the last camps to be liberated during the Allied march through Germany, and when they found him, he was at death's door. When he had left the United States, James had weighed about 180 pounds, give or take, but by the time they brought him back to the American Field Hospital, he didn't weigh a pound over 95. Skeletal, they called it. But in the months following his rescue, he gained some weight, learned to walk again, and the first thing he asked for was for them to contact his wife. A few days later, Dora Ann received his telegram, and she and the clerk knew their relationship was doomed. James returned home, and the whole town welcomed him as a hero, including Dora. But there was one big problem. She didn't want to end her relationship with the clerk, which resulted in a serious error in judgment. One night, after a heavy drinking session with his old high school buddies, James Cranwell came home to find his wife in bed with that grocery store clerk. What happened next is something that hardly deserves to be repeated, so I'll try to put it implicitly. Cranwell was furious. He beat the clerk to a pulp, tied him to the bed frame with his belt, and then set about teaching Dora Ann a lesson. But that wasn't enough. When his friends tried to leave, Cranwell insisted they stay and watch. Then, when he was done, he demanded that they teach Dora Ann a lesson too. And they beat that girl and then took turns abusing her. Then, when it was all over, the clerk, who had been forced to witness the whole thing from just a few feet away, was dragged into the woods outside of town and then shot in the head. Cranwell and his friends then did something to hide the body. No one knows what because it was never found, but Dora Ann knew they had killed the clerk and she told the town sheriff about it when he asked her. Cranwell kept Dora locked up for a few days and then threw her out of the house barefoot, with nothing but a dirty dress. She walked into town and went straight to the sheriff's office to tell him everything. The sheriff went to talk to Cranwell, but he denied it all. Yes, it was true that he had come home to find his wife in bed with another man after falsely believing he would be out all night. And sure, he might have slapped the guy around a bit before throwing him out, but he hadn't killed him. He had threatened to kill him if he ever saw him again, but he hadn't murdered him. No, the clerk had disappeared out of shame for what he had done. And if he ever reappeared in town, Cranwell claimed he was willing to let the incident slide and make amends. Reluctantly, the sheriff agreed. The problem was that if he had a shred of evidence that Cranwell had killed the clerk, or if he could prove beyond a doubt that everything Dora Ann said was true, he'd be happy to present a case against Cranwell and his friends. But aside from Dora Ann, who at that point wasn't looked upon favorably due to her decision to continue the affair, the sheriff had no witnesses, no evidence, and therefore no case. But that didn't sit well with the people of Bakersville. From their perspective, the only thing they noticed at first was that the clerk was missing, and it took days before Dora Ann came into town to give a statement to the sheriff and his deputies. After that, news of the incident spread like wildfire, and while everyone agreed that Dora and her lover should have ended the affair, no one thought it deserved a death sentence. And what Cranwell and his friends had done to Dora Ann was nothing short of unforgivable. Certain figures approached the town sheriff and begged him to do something about it. The sheriff then ordered tracking dogs to search around Cranwell's property, and they picked up the scent of a body that had been moved at some point in the last week or so. This alone was incriminating, but the deputies couldn't find any corpse since the trail simply faded somewhere in the woods near Rattlesnake Ridge. Sure, someone else might have killed the clerk, and maybe they did it on his property, Cranwell claimed. But it sure wasn't him, and his soon-to-be ex-wife was welcome to press charges if she wanted to. But she didn't. Instead, Dora Ann went to live with her parents and spent the foreseeable future hiding in her old childhood bedroom, sunk into a deep depression. It was an incredibly sad and horrible situation, but the people of Bakersville weren't willing to let such an atrocity go without consequences. Months passed, and with each day that went by, those who had murdered the clerk became more and more convinced that they had gotten away with it. But one night, Bakersville went to bed without a care in the world, and the next morning the residents woke up to find the town filled with state patrol officers. Overnight, not only had Cranwell's house caught fire, presumably with James Arthur burned to ashes inside, but also his two old high school friends had suffered mysterious and horrible accidents. One had driven off the road on a clear stretch of highway, and then crashed into a tree at what must have been at least 50 miles per hour. The other had drunk an entire bottle of bad whiskey, and had slowly been poisoned while unconscious. The three suspicious deaths caused a major stir in law enforcement channels, and with the local fire department and the sheriff's office overwhelmed with the various scenes, the state patrol was called in. They visited every house in town, asking everyone the same two questions. Did you see anything? And did you hear anything? For both questions, everyone gave the same two answers, no and no. Somehow 3 men had died without anyone in the town having the slightest idea how they had lost their lives. To the town's residents, it was a strange accident, and the fact that all 3 men had died within hours of each other and all had been involved in the clerk's disappearance. Well, that was just a big coincidence, right? Just like it had been a mere coincidence that someone had been killed on James Cranwell's property the same night the clerk disappeared. Only one of the deaths was proven to be murder, as the state patrol showed that the fire at Cranwell's house was caused by arson. But as for his 2 friends, both deaths seemed to be nothing more than tragic accidents. When the news of their deaths reached Dora Ann, it was said that she smiled for the first time in months. She began eating properly again, sleeping well again, and after a while she started taking long walks in the woods. She went out alone most days, leaving just after sunrise and returning just before sunset, and she spent every trip wandering through the last place where the tracking dogs had picked up the scent of the clerk's body on Rattlesnake Ridge. She was looking for the body, and she kept looking for years and years until one day, Dora Ann stopped coming home. People thought maybe she had taken her own life out there. Others thought she had been bitten by a rattlesnake or had had a run-in with a protective mother bear. But then, sometime later, I guess someone must have found her cabin out there, either newly built or makeshiftly renovated, and then word got out that she was still alive. I suppose the deaths of the men must have stayed in people's minds for a while, long enough for their children and grandchildren to talk about it, and that's when I think the rumors of witchcraft started to quiet down curious kids. The less it was talked about, the better, and if kids insisted on talking about it, it was best to wrap the truth in myth and legend. I suppose Dora Ann figured she'd be better positioned to find the body of her former lover if she resided near its last known location. That way she could spend the rest of her days searching for it while being pleasantly isolated from a world that had so terribly disappointed her. May she and her deceased lover rest in peace, and many thanks to the old man in the bar that night who finally gave us the answers to the long-standing mystery of the Witch of Rattlesnake Ridge. I've always been an active person, and my way of escaping the stress of everyday life has been to go hiking. It's something I love. The combination of fresh air, nature, and the silence broken only by the sound of my own footsteps helps clear my mind. I live in a city where the mountains aren't too far away, and there's one trail in particular that I've always liked. It's not very busy, which gives me the peace I'm looking for, and the view from the top is stunning. That particular morning seemed like any other. I packed my gear, filled my water bottle, and headed to the trail I always chose. The day was perfect for a hike. The sun was shining, but the air was cool enough that I didn't feel hot. I arrived at the trailhead parking lot a bit later than usual, but there was no one else there. This struck me as odd since there were usually at least one or two cars. I didn't think much of it though, and was glad to have the trail all to myself. The trail starts in a wooded area and then opens up to a clearer part where you can see the valley below. That first part is always the most peaceful, and I like to let the rhythm of my steps fall in line with my breathing. I immersed myself in the sound of the wind through the trees and the crunch of branches under my boots. I had been walking for about an hour when I noticed her. At first I thought I was alone, but when I looked back I saw a woman quite far off, about 100 meters behind me. At first I didn't think much of it. Many people enjoy these trails, and although it wasn't too crowded that day, it wasn't impossible that someone else had decided to take advantage of the good weather. I kept walking, maintaining my pace. A few minutes later, I glanced back again, and the woman was still there. The distance between us hadn't changed much. What struck me as odd was that although she seemed to have started her hike much later than me, she wasn't trying to overtake me or close the distance between us. She just kept walking at a steady pace, always the same distance behind me. I began to feel a little uneasy. The trail was wide enough for someone to pass if they wanted to, but this person seemed determined to maintain the same distance, neither closer nor farther. I tried to brush the thought aside. She's just another hiker, I kept telling myself. I moved on, now more aware of my surroundings. I watched the trees, the sounds of the forest, anything to distract myself. After a while, I reached a fork in the path. The main trail continued toward the summit, but there was another, narrower and less traveled path that led to a less known part of the park. I decided to take that detour, thinking it would be a good chance to get away from any discomfort. I took the turn without looking back, convinced the woman would stick to the main trail. A few minutes later, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to have shaken off my uncomfortable company. But I hadn't. To my surprise, the woman had also taken the same detour. She was now closer, maybe about 70 meters away. She wasn't speeding up, she didn't seem to be in a hurry, but there she was, still following me. My discomfort turned into anxiety. This was no longer just a coincidence. Something about her behavior deeply unsettled me. I began to wonder if I should stop and talk to her, but the idea terrified me as much as the fact that she was following me. I couldn't quite put my finger on what made me feel so uneasy, but there was something in the way she moved, always keeping the same distance, that gave me chills. I decided to pick up the pace. I didn't want to run, not yet, but I wanted to put a little more distance between us. I felt my breathing start to quicken, though I tried to stay calm. I looked back again. To my horror, I saw that she had also sped up, not much, just enough to maintain the same distance between us. This was no coincidence anymore, she was deliberately following me. My mind started racing. What did she want from me? Why wasn't she getting closer? Why wasn't she saying anything? I felt my heart begin to beat faster, and sweat started to form on my forehead. I tried to think of all the possible reasons why someone would do something like this, but none of them comforted me. I kept walking, my steps now more hurried. Every time I looked back, she was still there, relentless, as if she were toying with me. There was something about her stillness, her consistency, that made me more and more nervous. I couldn't see her face clearly due to the distance, but the way she followed me, as if she had no other purpose than to keep me in sight, was becoming increasingly disturbing. Maybe 20 minutes of this strange game passed before things got worse. The trail narrowed again, and now I could only see small bursts of light through the trees that crowded on either side. That's when, up ahead, I saw movement. 3 more figures appeared on the path in front of me, 3 men walking toward me in the opposite direction. My heart stopped for a moment. I looked around, trying to assess the situation. I was trapped between the woman following me from behind and these 3 men now coming toward me. I tried not to panic, but every fiber of my being told me something was terribly wrong. Every instinct screamed that I needed to get away. When the men saw me, they didn't say anything. They didn't greet me or show any signs of being just regular hikers. They just kept walking, slowly approaching. And the strangest thing was that, like the woman, they didn't seem to be in any rush, but they didn't stop moving toward me either. It was as if they were boxing me in. I felt my hands start to sweat and my body tensed up. I knew I couldn't keep walking forward. My options were limited. The path was narrow, and there was no visible way out around me. The trees were dense, the branches seemed to form a natural barrier, and I couldn't see anywhere to run to for escape. The fear was no longer just a vague feeling. It was palpable, like a weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I knew I couldn't just stand there waiting to see what these men would do. I had to act. I didn't know exactly what they wanted, but the way they were closing in on me left little doubt that I couldn't afford to stay there and find out. I made a quick decision. I turned around and started running. The sound of my boots pounding the dry ground of the trail echoed in my ears like drums. I didn't stop to see if the men were following me, nor did I look back to see the woman. I just ran, letting the instinct to survive take over my body. The trail, which had once been a place of peace, now felt like a trap, a tunnel with no way out. Each step I took brought me closer to the feeling of being cornered. My lungs burned and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it was going to explode. My body had already been tired before I started running, but adrenaline was the only thing keeping me moving. I couldn't let them catch me. I didn't want to know what would happen if they did. The path twisted and turned through the trees, and the exposed roots kept making me stumble. I couldn't afford to fall. I knew if I stopped, even for a second, they would be upon me. The wind whipped at my face and my vision began to blur from the sweat gathering on my forehead. As I ran, I could hear footsteps behind me. They weren't hurried, but they didn't stop. They were following me slowly, but with a determination that made my skin crawl. It was as if they knew I would eventually tire out. They were hunting me. In my mind, questions swirled. Why were they following me? What did they want? What did the woman have to do with the three men? Everything felt like a bad dream, something that shouldn't be happening in real life. But the pain in my muscles, the cold air burning my lungs, reminded me that this was real, very real. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. The trail seemed endless, and every time I looked to the sides, the trees grew denser, preventing me from finding an easy way out. I couldn't just run into the forest. It would be impossible to find my way in that tangle of branches and roots, and they would easily find me. My mind raced, looking for a solution. There had to be some way to escape, somewhere to hide, to buy some time to think. That's when I saw it. Off to the side of the trail, half hidden among the trees, was an old car. It wasn't clear how it had gotten there since the trail wasn't accessible by vehicle, but there it was, covered in dust and fallen leaves as if it had been abandoned for years. I didn't think twice. I ran to the car knowing it wasn't the perfect hiding spot, but it was all I had. I quickly crouched down and slid under the car, the cold metal pressing against my back. The space was tight, but enough that I wouldn't be seen at first glance if they passed by. My chest rose and fell heavily, and I tried to control my breathing so I wouldn't give myself away. The silence was deafening. I could only hear my own breath and the pounding of my heart, which thundered in my ears. The fear had transformed into a kind of nervous calm, a waiting game that seemed to stretch on forever. I struggled to keep my head clear, but the thoughts kept rushing in. Would they find me? What would they do if they did? And then I heard them. Footsteps. First, it was the woman. She was walking slowly along the path, right next to the car. My entire body tensed up. I could see her feet through the gaps between the wheels. She stopped for a moment, right in front of the car. I held my breath, expecting the worst. The silence grew even heavier, as if time had stopped. After what felt like an eternity, she kept walking. A few minutes later, the three men passed by as well. Their footsteps were heavier, as if they were tired from following me. I saw them pass by one, their boots leaving prints in the dust on the trail. I felt a wave of relief when they disappeared from view, but I didn't dare move yet. I stayed under the car for what felt like hours, though it was only a few minutes. My mind was blank. I just knew I couldn't stay there forever, but I also couldn't leave without making sure they were far away. When I finally decided to move, I did so as quietly as possible. I slid out from under the car, trying not to make any noise. The trail was empty. The wind had resumed its whispering through the trees, and everything seemed to have returned to normal. But I knew they were still out there somewhere, looking for me. I knew I couldn't go back the way I had come, so I opted to run in the opposite direction. I didn't have a clear plan. I just needed to get as far away from them as possible. The trail was narrower, but I didn't care anymore. My legs ached, but fear kept pushing me forward. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, I reached a small clearing. I couldn't believe it. In the distance, I saw the building of the police station. My legs, exhausted and trembling, found one last reserve of energy. I ran toward the station, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got inside, I could barely speak. I was drenched in sweat, my breathing ragged. I collapsed into a chair at the front desk, trying to explain to the officer on duty what had happened. I don't know how, but I managed to tell the story between gasps, trying to make them understand the gravity of the situation. The police took my statement and went to investigate the area, but they found no one. The men and the woman had disappeared, as if they had never been there. It was as if the forest had swallowed them up. I never found out who those people were or what they wanted from me. All I know is that from that day on, I never went hiking alone again. The experience left a mark on me, and although I try not to think about it too much, the images from that day still come back to my mind from time to time. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen that car, or if they had found me. It's a thought that haunts me to this day.